The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace buzzed with quiet conversations and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Foreign diplomats, government officials, and distinguished guests mingled beneath crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across marble floors. It was the annual International Relations Gala, one of the most prestigious events on the royal calendar. James Wellington had been standing at his post for 3 hours now. As a senior member of the Queen's Guard, he was used to long ceremonies and formal events. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, his black boots polished to a mirror shine, and his tall bearskin hat sat precisely on his head. To most guests, he was simply part of the palace furniture, a silent, stoic figure who blended into the background. But James was far from silent in his thoughts. At 42 years old, he had served the royal family for nearly 20 years. He had seen presidents come and go, witnessed historic handshakes and heated arguments behind closed doors. His position required absolute discretion, and he had always honored that trust. Until tonight. The crowd stirred as a familiar figure entered the ballroom. Donald Trump Jr. strode in with his usual confidence, flanked by his security detail and several business associates. He was in London for a real estate venture, something involving luxury hotels and golf courses. The invitation to tonight's gala had come through diplomatic channels, a courtesy extended to prominent American businessmen. James watched as Trump Jr. made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with various dignitaries. The young businessman's loud laugh echoed across the room several times, drawing attention from nearby conversations. Some guests seemed charmed by his American directness, while others appeared less impressed by his casual approach to royal protocol. As the evening progressed, James noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Trump Jr. was speaking with Lord Hamilton, the elderly chairman of several children's charities. The conversation seemed friendly enough from a distance, but James had exceptionally good hearing, a skill that had served him well in his years of service. The key is knowing which organizations really make a difference, Trump Jr. was saying, his voice carrying just enough for James to catch every word. Some of these charity things, they're just tax write-offs. But when you find the right ones, especially those dealing with kids, you can really make an impact. Lord Hamilton nodded enthusiastically. Indeed, we've always believed that transparency is crucial in charitable work. Every pound donated should go directly to helping the children. James felt something cold settle in his chest. 3 months ago, he had been assigned to a special security detail. His job had been to accompany the royal family during their visit to a children's hospital that had recently received a substantial donation from an American businessman. The donation had made headlines, £5 million to help sick children receive better treatment. What the headlines hadn't mentioned, and what James had accidentally overheard during a private phone call, was the truth behind that donation. The money had indeed been donated, but it had come with strings attached. The hospital had been pressured to purchase all their new medical equipment from a specific supplier, a company that happened to be owned by the same person who had made the donation. The equipment cost exactly £5 million, but its actual value was closer to $2 million. The remaining $3 million had effectively been funneled back to the donor through inflated prices. The conversation between Trump Jr. and Lord Hamilton continued, with both men discussing various charitable initiatives and their potential for mutual benefit. James watched as they shook hands warmly, with Lord Hamilton looking genuinely pleased about whatever arrangement they had just discussed. As the evening wore on, James found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable. He had always prided himself on his professionalism and his ability to remain neutral in all situations. His job was to protect and serve, not to judge or interfere. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he was watching a conversation that might lead to the exploitation of charitable funds meant for vulnerable children. The gala continued around him, with guests enjoying gourmet food and fine wine while discussing politics, business, and social causes. To everyone else, it was a successful diplomatic event. But for James, each passing minute felt heavier than the last. He kept thinking about the children's hospital, about the families who had been so grateful for the donation, never knowing that most of the money had quietly found its way back to the donor's pocket. When the evening finally ended and the guests began to leave, James remained at his post until the last diplomat had departed. His replacement arrived for the night shift, and finally, James could remove his ceremonial uniform and head home. But as he walked through the quiet streets of London, he couldn't shake the weight of what he had witnessed. At home in his small flat, James sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. On the wall opposite him hung a photograph from his early days in the Guard, taken during a ceremony honoring charitable organizations that had made significant contributions to children's welfare. He stared at the photo, remembering how proud he had felt to be part of something that protected and honored such important work. Now that same sense of duty was pulling him in a different direction. He thought about his oath of service, about the confidentiality he had sworn to maintain, but he also thought about the children who would suffer if charitable funds continued to be manipulated and diverted from their intended purpose. James reached for his phone, then stopped. Once he made this call, there would be no going back. His career, his reputation, everything he had built over 20 years of faithful service would be at risk. But as he thought about those hospital beds and the families counting on charitable donations to save their children's lives, he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. The next morning came too quickly for James. He had barely slept, tossing and turning as his mind replayed the previous evening's events over and over. By 6 o'clock, he gave up on sleep entirely and made himself a strong cup of coffee. The decision he had been wrestling with all night still weighed heavily on his shoulders. James had always been a methodical person. 20 years in the Guard had taught him the importance of careful planning and precise execution. If he was going to break his silence about what he had witnessed, he needed to do it properly. He couldn't just make wild accusations without proof. He needed to be smart about this. He spent the morning researching everything he could find about charitable fraud and how it was typically exposed. The internet was full of stories about donations that never reached their intended recipients, about administrative costs that consumed most of the funds, and about complex schemes that allowed donors to claim tax benefits while actually profiting from their supposed generosity. What James had witnessed at the children's hospital wasn't exactly fraud in the traditional sense. The money had been donated, and the hospital had received medical equipment. But the manipulation of the process, the inflated prices, and the way the donor had essentially paid himself with charitable funds, that felt deeply wrong to James, even if it might not be technically illegal. Around noon, James received a call that made his blood run cold. It was his supervisor at the palace, informing him that he had been selected for another special assignment. This time, he would be providing security for a private meeting between several high-profile American businessmen and British charity organizations. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and it would be held at a prestigious London hotel. "It's quite an honor, Wellington," his supervisor said cheerfully. "These American gentlemen specifically requested our finest personnel. Apparently, they're planning some major charitable initiatives and want to ensure complete privacy and security for their discussions." James felt sick to his stomach. He recognized the names on the list his supervisor read to him. Trump Jr. was among the attendees, along with several other wealthy Americans who had recently made headlines for their philanthropic efforts. The British organizations included some of the most respected children's charities in the country. After hanging up the phone, James sat in stunned silence. It was as if the universe was forcing him to confront this situation head-on. He could either continue to stand by silently while potentially witnessing more charitable funds being manipulated, or he could take action before it was too late. That afternoon, James made a decision that would change everything. He called Rebecca Martinez, an investigative journalist who had made a name for herself exposing corruption in high places. Rebecca had written several articles about charitable fraud, and James had been following her work for months. If anyone would know how to handle this situation properly, it would be her. "Ms. Martinez, my name is James Wellington," he said when she answered the phone. "I'm calling about a story that I think you might be interested in. It involves charitable donations, wealthy Americans, and some very vulnerable children." Rebecca's voice immediately sharpened with interest. "I'm listening. But before you say anything else, I need to know, are you prepared to go on the record with whatever information you have?" James took a deep breath. This was it. The point of no return. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am." They arranged to meet that evening at a small cafe in South London, far from the tourist areas and government buildings where James might be recognized. Rebecca arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately. When James walked in, still wearing civilian clothes, she was struck by how ordinary he looked. This wasn't the type of source she usually dealt with. No flashy personality, no obvious agenda, just a quiet man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Before we begin," Rebecca said as James sat down, "I need to understand what's motivating you to come forward. You're risking your career, possibly your entire future. Why now?" James stared into his coffee cup for a long moment before answering. "3 months ago, I watched a children's hospital celebrate a donation that they thought would help save lives. The families were so grateful, so hopeful. But I know the truth about where most of that money actually went. And now I'm being asked to provide security for a meeting where the same thing might happen to other charities." He looked up at Rebecca, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "I took an oath to serve and protect. I always thought that meant protecting the royal family and the government officials I was assigned to guard. But maybe it means something bigger than that. Maybe it means protecting the people who can't protect themselves." Rebecca spent the next 2 hours listening as James carefully recounted everything he had witnessed and overheard. She took detailed notes, asking clarifying questions and pushing for specific details. As an experienced investigative journalist, she knew that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. "This is certainly troubling," she said finally. "But you have to understand that what you're describing walks a very fine line between unethical behavior and actual criminal activity. Without concrete proof of fraud or misrepresentation, it's going to be very difficult to build a case that will hold up to scrutiny." James nodded. He had expected this response. "That's why I called you before next week's meeting. If these charitable organizations are about to be pressured into similar arrangements, maybe we can document it as it happens." Rebecca's eyes lit up with the thrill of a potential major story. "You're talking about recording conversations, gathering evidence in real time. That's extremely dangerous for you. If you're caught, you'll face serious legal consequences, not to mention the end of your career." "I understand the risks," James said quietly. "But I also understand what happens when good people do nothing while bad things happen to innocent children." They spent another hour discussing the logistics of what James was proposing. Rebecca explained the legal protections for whistleblowers and the potential consequences he might face. She also outlined the type of evidence that would be needed to make a compelling case and the steps they would need to take to protect both of them during the investigation. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Rebecca placed a hand on James's shoulder. "I want you to go home tonight and really think about this decision. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Your life is going to change completely, and not all of those changes will be positive." James looked her in the eye with a steadiness that impressed her. "My life already changed last night when I decided I couldn't live with staying silent. Now I'm just figuring out how to move forward with that decision." Walking home through the quiet London streets, James felt a strange sense of peace, despite the uncertainty ahead. For the first time in months, he felt like he was taking action rather than just witnessing injustice from the sidelines. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing for what might be the most important week of his life. The week passed in a blur of preparation and mounting anxiety. James continued his regular duties at the palace, maintaining his professional demeanor while internally preparing for what could be the most significant moment of his career. Rebecca had provided him with a small recording device, barely larger than a coin, that could capture conversations from several feet away. "Remember," she had told him during their final meeting before the charity event, "we're not looking for a smoking gun confession. We're documenting patterns of behavior, pressure tactics, and any evidence that charitable funds are being manipulated for personal gain." The evening of the private charity meeting arrived with typical London rain pattering against the windows of the prestigious Mayfair Hotel. James arrived early, as was his custom, to inspect the venue and coordinate with the hotel's security staff. The meeting would take place in the Wellington Suite, an elegant conference room on the hotel's top floor with panoramic views of the city. As James positioned himself at his assigned post near the entrance to the suite, he felt the small recording device tucked discreetly inside his uniform jacket. His heart was beating faster than usual, but his hands remained steady. 2 decades of training had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, and tonight he would need every bit of that. Discipline. The first to arrive were the representatives from the British charities. James recognized several faces from newspaper photographs. Directors of organizations that provided medical care for children, funded educational programs in underprivileged areas, and supported families dealing with serious illnesses. They entered with quiet confidence, carrying briefcases filled with proposals and presentations about their ongoing work. 20 minutes later, the American delegation arrived. Trump Jr. led the group, his voice echoing down the hallway as he laughed at something one of his companions had said. Behind him walked 3 other men, all expensively dressed and carrying themselves with the unmistakable confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Gentlemen, welcome to London," called out Margaret Whitfield, the director of the Children's Medical Foundation, as she rose to greet them. "We're absolutely thrilled to have this opportunity to discuss how we might work together." James watched from his position as handshakes were exchanged and pleasantries shared. The Americans took their seats on one side of the polished conference table, while the charity representatives arranged themselves on the other side. To anyone observing, it looked like a perfectly normal business meeting between potential partners. "Before we begin," Trump Jr. said, his tone friendly but businesslike, "I want everyone to understand that what we discuss tonight stays in this room. We're talking about significant financial commitments, and discretion is absolutely essential for everyone involved." The charity representatives nodded eagerly. James felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard similar words at the Children's Hospital, right before the conversation had turned to the practical arrangements that would govern the donation. For the first hour, the discussion remained general. The Americans asked detailed questions about each charity's operations, their current funding sources, and their most pressing needs. The charity representatives presented their cases passionately, describing the children and families they served and the difference that additional funding could make. James listened carefully, noting how skillfully the Americans were gathering information. They weren't just asking about financial needs, they were mapping out each organization's entire operation, identifying potential vulnerabilities and dependencies. "Now," said one of Trump Jr.'s companions, a silver-haired man named Robert Chen, "let's talk about how we might structure our support to ensure maximum impact and efficiency." What followed was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as generosity. Chen began by explaining how traditional charitable giving often led to waste and inefficiency. He painted a picture of well-meaning organizations that lacked the business expertise to truly maximize their impact. "What we propose," Chen continued, "is a partnership model. We provide significant funding, but we also provide business guidance. and operational support to ensure that every dollar is used as effectively as possible. Margaret Whitfield leaned forward eagerly. That sounds wonderful. We're always looking for ways to improve our efficiency and reach more children in need. James watched as the Americans exchanged subtle glances. The trap was being set, and the charity representatives were walking into it willingly. Trump Jr. took over the conversation. Here's how it would work. We commit to providing each of your organizations with substantial funding. We're talking about amounts that could double or triple your current budgets. In return, you agree to work with our recommended suppliers and service providers for major purchases and operational needs. The room fell silent as the charity representatives absorbed this information. James could see the wheels turning in their minds, the appeal of dramatically increased funding battling against questions about the strings attached. These suppliers, asked David Morrison, the Director of Educational Opportunities for All, they would be companies that you recommend based on their quality and value? Absolutely, Chen replied smoothly. We've worked with these organizations for years. They provide excellent services at competitive rates. The arrangement ensures that charitable funds are used efficiently while supporting businesses that share our commitment to social responsibility. James felt his stomach clench. He was hearing the same pitch that had been made to the Children's Hospital, dressed up in slightly different language but fundamentally identical in its deception. And the savings from these efficient arrangements, Trump Jr. added, allow us to provide even more funding to worthy causes. It's a win-win situation for everyone involved. What he didn't mention, and what James knew from his previous observations, was that the competitive rates charged by these recommended suppliers were typically 2 to 3 times the market rate for similar services. The efficiency savings existed only on paper, while the excess payments flowed back to the donors through complex ownership structures and partnership agreements. Margaret Whitfield spoke up with obvious excitement. This could be transformational for our organization. We could expand our mobile medical units, hire additional specialists, perhaps even open a new treatment center. The Americans smiled warmly, and James could see that they had successfully hooked their first target. The promise of dramatic expansion was intoxicating to people who had spent years struggling to secure adequate funding for their vital work. As the evening progressed, each charity representative was drawn into individual discussions about their specific needs and how the partnership model could address them. James watched the Americans work with practiced efficiency, tailoring their pitch to each organization's particular vulnerabilities and aspirations. The recording device in his jacket continued to capture every word, every promise, every carefully crafted deception. James knew that by the end of the evening he would have documented what amounted to a systematic plan to exploit charitable organizations for personal profit. But he also knew that the real test was yet to come. The Americans were laying the groundwork tonight, building trust and establishing relationships. The actual pressure to accept inflated contracts and questionable arrangements would come later, once the charity representatives had time to become emotionally invested in the promised funding. The meeting stretched past midnight, with the Americans skillfully working each charity representative through detailed financial projections and partnership agreements. James maintained his stoic position by the door, but inside he was growing, increasingly disturbed by what he was witnessing. The manipulation was becoming more explicit as the evening wore on, and the charity directors became more committed to the promised funding. Around 1 in the morning, Trump Jr. pulled out a tablet and began showing the group photographs of previous successful partnerships. James recognized several of the images. They were from the Children's Hospital he had visited months earlier, showing the medical equipment that had been purchased with the manipulated donation. This cardiac monitoring system, Trump Jr. said, pointing to a photograph of gleaming medical equipment, cost the hospital £5 million through our recommended supplier. The same equipment would have cost them £8 million if they had gone through traditional procurement channels. James felt his jaw clench. He knew the real numbers. The equipment's actual market value was closer to £2 million. The hospital had received what they needed, but they had paid more than double the fair price, with the excess money flowing back to Trump Jr.'s network through inflated contracts. Margaret Whitfield gasped with admiration. "That's an incredible savings. The children's lives that could be saved with that kind of efficiency." "Exactly," Trump Jr. replied, his voice taking on an almost evangelical tone. "This is why we're so passionate about this partnership model. It's not just about providing funding, it's about revolutionizing how charitable organizations operate." David Morrison, from Educational Opportunities for All, raised a hesitant hand. "I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but how do we verify that these suppliers are truly offering the best value? Our board requires us to get competitive bids for major purchases." The room went quiet for a moment. James watched as the Americans exchanged glances, and he could see them recalibrating their approach. Chen stepped in smoothly. "That's an excellent question, David, and it shows exactly the kind of fiscal responsibility we want to support. Here's how the verification process works." He pulled out a folder filled with official-looking documents. "Our recommended suppliers go through an extensive vetting process that includes price comparison analysis, quality certification, and performance guarantees. When you work with them, you're not just getting competitive pricing. You're getting prices that have already been negotiated down through our bulk purchasing power." It was a masterful lie, delivered with complete confidence and backed up by professional-looking paperwork. James could see the charity representatives relaxing as Chen presented documentation that appeared to validate everything they had been told. Additionally, Trump Jr. added, the partnership agreements include performance clauses that protect the charitable organizations. If the suppliers don't deliver as promised, we step in to make things right, including providing additional funding to cover any shortfalls. James knew this was another deception. The performance clauses were designed to look protective, while actually binding the charities to use only the inflated price suppliers. Any attempt to source equipment or services elsewhere would violate the agreement and result in the loss of all funding. The evening finally concluded with the Americans presenting each charity with a preliminary partnership proposal. The documents were professionally bound and filled with impressive financial projections, showing how much each organization could accomplish with the promised funding increases. "Take these home. Review them carefully with your boards," Trump Jr. said as he shook hands with each charity representative. "We're looking at making these partnerships official within the next month, so there's some urgency, but we want you to be completely comfortable with every aspect of the arrangement." James watched as the charity representatives left the hotel, their faces glowing with excitement and hope. They were carrying what they believed to be the solution to years of financial struggles and the key to dramatically expanding their ability to help vulnerable children and families. After the British representatives departed, James noticed that the Americans didn't immediately leave. Instead, they remained in the conference room, and their conversation took on a completely different tone. "That went even better than expected," Chen said, loosening his tie and pouring himself a drink from the hotel's well-stocked bar cart. "The Medical Foundation woman is going to be particularly easy to work with. Did you see her eyes light up when we showed her those hospital photos?" Trump Jr. laughed. "She's already spending the money in her head. By the time she realizes what the real arrangement looks like, she'll be too invested to back out." "What about the education guy?" asked another member of their group. He seemed more cautious. "Morrison will come around," Trump Jr. replied confidently. "His organization is desperate for funding. They've been operating on a shoestring budget for 3 years. When push comes to shove, he'll take the deal rather than let his programs fail." James felt sick listening to this cold calculation of how to exploit people's genuine desire to help others. These men were treating charitable work like a business opportunity, viewing the charity director's compassion and dedication as weaknesses to be manipulated. "The beauty of this model," Chen continued, "is that everyone thinks they're getting a good deal. The charities get their funding increases, the suppliers get guaranteed contracts at premium rates, and we get our returns plus the tax benefits of charitable giving. It's perfectly legal and everyone walks away happy. Well, almost everyone, Trump Jr. said with a smirk. The kids getting helped by these charities are still getting helped, just at a higher cost per child than necessary. But they don't know that. And frankly, they don't need to know that. The casual dismissal of the impact on the actual beneficiaries of charitable work hit James like a physical blow. These children and families weren't just statistics to him. He had seen them during his security detail at the hospital, had watched parents desperately hoping that donations would provide the medical care their children needed to survive. The Americans spent another 30 minutes discussing logistics, timelines, and strategies for handling any potential resistance from the charity boards. They talked about these organizations and their beneficiaries as if they were chess pieces in a complex financial game. Finally, the group began to disperse. James maintained his professional demeanor as they filed past him, each man nodding politely, to acknowledge his presence without really seeing him. To them, he was just part of the hotel's furniture, a silent, uniformed figure whose job was to stand still and look official. After the last American had left the suite, James remained at his post for another 15 minutes, ensuring that the area was secure and that no confidential materials had been left behind. Then finally, he was free to leave. Walking through the empty hotel corridors, James felt the weight of the evening's revelations pressing down on him. The recording device in his jacket contained several hours of conversations that documented a systematic plan to exploit charitable organizations. But more than that, it contained evidence of the callous attitude these men held toward the vulnerable people who would ultimately pay the price for their greed. As he stepped out into the cool London night, James pulled out his phone and sent a simple text message to Rebecca Martinez. "We got everything. Meet tomorrow morning. This is bigger than we thought." Rebecca Martinez arrived at their meeting spot the next morning with dark circles under her eyes and 2 cups of strong coffee. She had spent most of the night researching the companies and individuals James had mentioned in his initial briefing, and what she had discovered made the recorded conversations even more damning. "James," she said as he sat down across from her in the same South London cafe they had used for their first meeting, "before we listen to these recordings, I need to tell you what I've uncovered about Trump Jr.'s business network. This isn't just about 1 or 2 questionable charitable partnerships. This appears to be a systematic operation involving dozens of companies and charitable organizations across multiple countries." She pulled out a folder thick with printed documents and financial records. "I've been tracking the ownership structures of the suppliers they recommend to charities. They're all connected through a web of shell companies, holding corporations, and partnership agreements. The money goes out as charitable donations, gets filtered through inflated contracts with these suppliers, and then flows back to the original donors through complex profit-sharing arrangements." James felt his stomach drop. "How many charities are we talking about?" "In the UK alone, at least 15 major organizations over the past 2 years. Internationally, the number could be in the hundreds." Rebecca leaned forward, her journalist's instincts fully engaged. "James, if what you recorded last night confirms what I suspect, we're looking at one of the largest charitable fraud schemes in modern history." They spent the next 3 hours going through the recordings, with Rebecca taking detailed notes and occasionally asking James to pause the playback while she cross-referenced names and companies with her research files. As the full scope of the scheme became clear, both of them grew increasingly grim. "Listen to this part again," Rebecca said, rewinding to a section where Trump Jr. was explaining the supplier verification process. "He's describing a fake competitive bidding system that's designed to make inflated prices look legitimate. The charity boards never see the real market prices because the comparison documents they're shown only include prices from companies within the same network." James nodded. And this part where they talk about the performance clauses, they're basically trap mechanisms. Once a charity signs on, they can't switch to genuine competitive suppliers without losing all their funding. The most damning part, Rebecca said, is their private conversation after the charity representatives left. That recording contains clear evidence that they know they're overcharging for services and that they're deliberately targeting vulnerable organizations that are desperate for funding. As they worked through the material, James couldn't help but think about Margaret Whitfield and David Morrison, the charity directors who had left the meeting so full of hope and excitement. In a few weeks, they would be presenting these partnership proposals to their boards of directors, genuinely believing they had found a solution to their funding challenges. "We have to warn them," James said suddenly. "These people have no idea what they're walking into." Rebecca looked up from her notes. "We will warn them, but we have to be strategic about how we do it. If we approach them directly right now, Trump Jr.'s group will know they've been exposed before we can publish the full story. They'll shut down their current operations, destroy evidence, and possibly disappear entirely." She pulled out a timeline she had been working on. "Here's what I propose. We spend the next 2 weeks building an airtight case, gathering additional evidence, and preparing a comprehensive exposé. Then we simultaneously contact all the affected charities, publish the story, and alert the relevant authorities." 2 weeks, James repeated, feeling the weight of that time frame. In 2 weeks, some of these charities might have already signed the partnership agreements. "I know it's not ideal," Rebecca admitted, "but if we move too quickly, we risk letting the people behind this scheme escape accountability entirely. These organizations have been operating for years. A few more weeks won't make or break their ability to face justice." Over the following days, James found it increasingly difficult to maintain his normal routine. He continued his duties at the palace, standing guard during ceremonies and official functions, but his mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of the investigation. Every time he saw a news story about a charitable donation or heard colleagues discussing philanthropic events, he felt the urge to speak up about what he knew. Rebecca, meanwhile, was working around the clock to build their case. She had contacted investigative journalists in other countries, sharing information about the international scope of the scheme while being careful not to reveal her source. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters from the United States, Canada, Australia, and several European countries confirmed that they had been tracking similar patterns of suspicious charitable partnerships in their own regions. "This is massive, James," Rebecca told him during one of their regular check-ins. "We're not just looking at a single fraud scheme. We're looking at a coordinated international operation that has been systematically exploiting charitable organizations for years." She showed him a world map marked with pins indicating confirmed locations where the scheme had operated. The total amount of money involved could be in the hundreds of millions of pounds. The number of children and families who have been affected by the reduced efficiency of charitable funding is staggering. As their investigation progressed, James began to receive subtle signs that his activities might have been noticed. His supervisor mentioned that he had been exceptionally focused lately, and a few colleagues asked if everything was all right. James managed to deflect these inquiries with explanations about personal stress and family concerns, but he could feel the walls closing in. The breaking point came during the second week of their investigation. James was assigned to provide security for another diplomatic event, this one involving several of the charity directors who had attended the hotel meeting. As he stood at his post, he watched Margaret Whitfield speaking enthusiastically with other guests about the exciting new partnership opportunities her organization was exploring. "It could double our capacity to help sick children," she was saying to a group of donors and supporters. "The American businessmen we've been working with have shown us financial models that are absolutely revolutionary. We could expand our mobile clinics, hire specialist staff, maybe even open satellite offices in underserved areas." James felt physically ill listening to her genuine excitement and hope. This woman had dedicated her life to helping vulnerable children, and she was unknowingly about to sign an agreement that would siphon millions of pounds away from that mission. That evening, James called Rebecca with a sense of urgency he had never felt before. "We can't wait any longer," he told her. "I just watched one of those charity directors talking about signing the partnership agreement next week. If we don't act now, it's going to be too late to prevent real damage." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "I understand how you feel, James, but we're so close to having everything we need for a bulletproof case. If we publish too early and there are holes in our evidence, these people will slip through those holes and continue operating somewhere else. And if we wait too long," James replied, his voice tight with emotion, "we'll be complicit in letting them steal money from sick children." The conversation ended without resolution, but James knew he had reached his limit. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way to warn the charities directly, regardless of the impact on the broader investigation. Some things were more important than perfect timing, and protecting vulnerable children was one of them. The next morning, James made a decision that would end his career, but potentially save millions of pounds meant for vulnerable children. He called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, and instead drove to the offices of the Children's Medical Foundation, where Margaret Whitfield was preparing to present the partnership proposal to her board of directors. The foundation's headquarters occupied a modest building in central London, far removed from the gleaming towers of international business. James sat in his car across the street for nearly an hour, watching staff members arrive for work and trying to summon the courage for what he was about to do. Once he walked through those doors, there would be no hiding his identity or protecting his position within the Royal Security Services. Finally, at precisely 10 o'clock, James crossed the street and approached the reception desk. The young woman behind the counter looked up with a friendly smile that faltered slightly when she saw his serious expression. "Good morning," James said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "My name is James Wellington. I work for the Royal Security Services, and I need to speak with Margaret Whitfield immediately. It's regarding the American partnership proposal she's considering." The receptionist's eyes widened. Let me call her office right away." Within minutes, Margaret Whitfield appeared in the reception area, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes that reflected decades of working with sick children and desperate families. "Mr. Wellington, isn't it? I believe I saw you at the hotel meeting last week. Is everything all right?" James looked around the busy reception area, noting the staff members and visitors who were beginning to take notice of their conversation. "Ms. Whitfield, I need to speak with you privately. What I have to tell you could save your organization from making a terrible mistake." Something in his tone convinced her to take him seriously. She led him to a small conference room and closed the door behind them. "Ms. Whitfield," James began, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I've been working in Royal Security for 20 years. I've taken an oath to protect and serve, and I've never broken that oath. But what I witnessed at that meeting last week has forced me to reconsider what those words really mean." He spent the next 30 minutes laying out everything he had observed and recorded. Margaret's face went through a progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age her 10 years in front of his eyes. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" she asked when he finished. "The financial projections they showed us, the equipment they've provided to other hospitals?" "The equipment was real," James confirmed, "but your organization would pay 2 to 3 times its actual value, with the excess money flowing back to Trump Jr. and his associates through the supplier network. The children would still receive care, but far fewer children than your funding should allow." Margaret sat in stunned silence for several minutes, staring at the partnership documents spread across the conference table. These papers had represented hope for her organization, the ability to help more families, save more lives, make a real difference in the world. "My board meeting is scheduled for this afternoon," she said finally. "We were going to vote on accepting the partnership. Some of our members were already talking about how to spend the additional funding. You need to contact the other organizations from that meeting," James told her. "Educational opportunities for all, the Family Support Network, all of them. They're walking into the same trap." Margaret picked up her phone immediately. "David Morrison at Educational Opportunities. I need to call him right now." Her hands were shaking as she dialed. While Margaret made her calls, James stepped outside the conference room and contacted Rebecca Martinez. The conversation was brief and tense. "You did what?" Rebecca's voice carried a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "James, we were 3 days away from having everything we needed to expose this internationally. Now they're going to know. They've been compromised." "I couldn't watch those people walk into that meeting this afternoon," James replied. "Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that you can't have perfect timing." Rebecca sighed deeply. "All right, it's done now. I'm calling my editor and pushing up our publication timeline. If this is going to blow up anyway, we need to get our story out before Trump Jr.'s people can spin the narrative or disappear." Over the next several hours, everything moved with breathtaking speed. Margaret Whitfield successfully contacted the other charity directors, all of whom immediately called emergency board meetings to reconsider the partnership proposals. Rebecca Martinez worked with her international colleagues to coordinate the simultaneous publication of exposés in multiple countries. By 6 o'clock that evening, the story was breaking across major news outlets worldwide. International charitable fraud scheme exposed by Royal Guard whistleblower became the lead story on BBC News, while American outlets ran headlines like "Trump Jr. allegedly connected to massive charity manipulation network." James watched the news coverage from his small flat, knowing that his phone would soon start ringing with calls from his supervisors, investigators, and likely lawyers representing various parties. His career in royal security was over, but as he watched Margaret Whitfield being interviewed about how the whistleblower had potentially saved her organization millions of pounds, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The interview was conducted in front of the children's hospital that had received the manipulated donation months earlier. Margaret stood beside Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's chief medical officer, as they explained how the investigation had revealed the true cost of the medical equipment they had celebrated receiving. "When we learned that our £5 million donation had really cost us £3 million in inflated prices," Dr. Chen said to the camera, "we realized that money could have funded an additional cardiac care unit. That's approximately 50 more children per year who could have received life-saving treatment." The reporter turned to Margaret. "What would have happened if this whistleblower hadn't come forward?" Margaret looked directly into the camera with fierce determination. "We would have unknowingly entered into an agreement that would have stolen millions of pounds from sick children over the next several years. This brave man didn't just save our organization, he saved the lives of children. We'll never meet, but who will receive care because charitable funds will now go where they're supposed to go." As the interview concluded, the reporter mentioned that Trump Jr. and his associates had refused requests for comment and that their representatives had issued statements denying any wrongdoing while announcing the immediate suspension of all international charitable partnership programs pending a full legal review. James turned off the television and sat in the quiet of his flat. Tomorrow would bring investigations, hearings, and probably legal challenges. His peaceful life as a royal guard was over, and his future was completely uncertain. But as he looked at the photograph on his wall from his early days in service, James realized that he had finally lived up to the oath he had taken 20 years earlier. He had served and protected those who needed it most, even when it meant sacrificing everything he had built for himself. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Rebecca Martinez. "James," she said, "I've been fielding calls all evening from other security personnel, government employees, and charity workers. Your decision to come forward has inspired dozens of other people to report suspicious activities they've witnessed. This story is going to keep growing." James smiled for the first time in weeks. "Good. Maybe some good will come out of all this chaos." "A lot of good," Rebecca corrected him. "The preliminary estimates suggest that the charities you helped protect will now be able to direct over £50 million toward their actual missions instead of padding the bank accounts of corrupt businessmen. Do you have any idea how many children's lives you've just saved?" James didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about all the families he had seen at the children's hospital, all the parents holding vigil beside their sick children's beds, praying for miracles that charitable donations could help provide. "I hope it was enough," he said finally. "I hope it was enough."